One day I will remember that. It looks like Lori just joined, and one other person, Megan.
I think I have the slides up now, right?
Yeah, you do.
Right. Tell me when to click. Look, comment, attendance.
Okay, so as you can see, we have the annual. Oh, you want to go to the next slide? Great. So not a whole lot has changed. We did have a meeting with WestEd and Ready CT about them submitting a data request. So we anticipate we will receive that sometime this month. But you can see that we have a number of data requests in different stages of the process. And the next big thing is getting the data from UConn and CSU to labor for the post-secondary outcomes multi-year data request. Are there any data requests that are in the pipeline that folks are aware of?
Yes, there's the one 26, which
DECD.
is the DECD one.
Yep, so I have that in May as the data request was submitted. So we can schedule some time to discuss next steps. Well, I know that we're waiting on the MOA.
Yeah, that's all that's needed. There's no next steps. Sorry, I didn't recognize it on there. Thanks.
Okay. All right, so that's all I have for the data request calendar. Do you want to go to the next slide and go over the technical upgrade or the changes?
Yes, and Patrick, this is, I think, a quick but good update. And Patrick, if there's anything you want to add, let me know. But I thought I would just put this on quickly since we had the meeting 2 weeks ago. Talked about the sort of status quo and the changes that would be needed to enable encryption at rest. Since the last meeting, the wonderful folks at Department of Labor and DSBES reviewed, implemented, tested, and communicated the changes out to, I think, all the parties that are kind of directly involved at both of those agencies. So as of, I think, yesterday afternoon, encryption at rest is fully enabled for the file transfer. There's no process change needed. There's no sort of like user impact. You don't need to do anything different than the sort of current practice for this. It's a behind the scenes change. And then the sort of one multi-year data request from CSU had been sort of voluntarily on hold until that was enabled. And so that can move forward. So I think that's, again, really like congratulations to the folks at Labor and Best for taking this on, understanding the issue and then going through and putting the changes in place quickly. And so again, I think Liam from Labor communicated yesterday, everything is ready to go. And so I think that's good news.
Yeah, obviously, if there are any questions, I'm happy to either answer them. And if I don't know the answer, to get answers from Liam. But we think everything is now resolved.
That's great. Progress is happening. Are there any questions or thoughts about this? If not, we can move on to the technical upgrade planning group update, which I will throw back to Scott.
Thank you, Katie. So this is, we're going to give an update and then we can have discussion about it or queue up an offline discussion or provide materials to anybody that's interested. But I think as folks are aware, earlier this year, we set up a technical upgrade planning group to kind of run in parallel with this. That is a mix of some of the folks from P20 Win agencies, both the sort of current and then the onboarding agencies, and then with folks from the state IT agency, DAS Best, and the Office of Health Strategy, to have a planning group that is meeting to kind of understand the way in which the technical infrastructure for P20 Win works, and to look at a few different topics that were part of the scope for the SLDS grant that CSD received last year. And so the planning group has kind of been meeting since February to go through, understand the status quo for these, the current system, talk to system users, go through 3 different use cases. And then we just met yesterday, and then the hope is we'll have a wrap up and a report out from the planning group in July, with the date to be determined. And then I forget what I put at the next slide. Oh, here we are. And then the goal is that group is providing, recommendations back to this group. And so it's a planning process. It doesn't have, they don't have the sort of authority as a group to undertake changes, but they'll make recommendations back to the data governing board. And depending on the nature and the scope of those changes, then we can also make recommendations up to the executive board. Probably, we're hoping if there's anything that would be in time for the August meeting. I think it remains to be seen whether there's anything kind of significant enough. The discussion on the data transmittal is a good example of something that actually came out of one of these meetings, where we had kind of a deep dive in the May meeting into how the data transmittal works, the software that's used for it, and going through that discussion, I think sort of identified the need to enable the encryption at rest. And then in a good example of like everyone working together, the DOL and BEST teams, sort of after identifying it, then implemented that change. So I think that's a good outcome that this group discussed at the last meeting from that process. But the whole process is, with the hope is, it will wrap up in July, make some recommendations, and the next slide has sort of the framework they're proposing to use for the recommendations. We want to make sure people are kind of aware this has been running in parallel. We have slides, recordings from the meetings. If there's anything that you want to go through, or more than happy to kind of talk through it. I know a couple of us in this meeting are also in those meetings. There's overlap. There's also overlap with the data stewards and the technical upgrade group. So Liam from Department of Labor is part of it. So it's a good, I think, mix of people and perspectives. And I think it's been kind of an encouraging process. And we wanted to make sure Data Governing Board is anticipating the wrap up of this in July. So July meeting or meetings, well, I would anticipate getting some recommendations back out of that process. And so, again, if there's questions on it or suggestions or things we want to attend to before the recommendations are complete, now is a great time and venue to bring those up. The next slide is right now, this is a framework that we're hoping to use for the recommendations, is kind of a table, or this table I think is giving the scope, I guess, of the recommendations, and we'll try and communicate something like this in a relatively condensed fashion to Data Governing Board and then Executive Board. And just to explain the sort of framework here, we're looking at 3 sort of buckets for recommendations. So the primary focus for Technical Upgrade Group is obviously on recommendations that are pertaining to the technology, which is the rightmost column along the top. But we wanted to make sure that people understood that they could also make recommendations to the process, or to sort of like the people, the human capital kind of involved in that process. So it's not just software and hardware, but it's really all of the components of sort of successful technical implementation are in scope, with kind of the main focus being technology, but it's not limited to that. So we had people, process, and technology as the buckets for recommendations. And then the 5 sort of subject matter areas are on the column on the left-hand side. So data transmittal, exactly what we just talked about, the data matching, how that's done, the software, technology, the methods that are used for that, privacy and security for the data as it kind of moves at the different points through the request process, system tools for analysis and visualization, and then the sort of data request management process itself, not so much the data, but the actual sort of administration management of that. So all of these have been topics that came up for discussion. I think they're loosely in the order of priority that the group identified. I might have that off slightly, but kind of we've gone through 3 different use cases. So Jan presented on the post-secondary outcomes request, the request 27 to 31 in April. We had a presentation of a sort of a preliminary proposal on data on juvenile justice in May, and then Bill Halsey from Department of Social Services talked about integrated care for kids yesterday. And so we had 3 use cases to make it concrete, and out of that process and the discussions in that group, we're hoping to produce some recommendations in July that you will hear about. Yeah, so we just want to make sure that's on folks' radar, and before you get recommendations, you know are apprised of that process and have a chance to weigh in, ask questions, get anything you want sort of on the table before it wraps up. In that vein, any questions, suggestions, comments? The table here is, again, this is sort of the format, the framework that we're looking at, and this is describing the current status. This is not recommendations, this is just reflecting, here's what we're using. So for data transmittal, for example, Axway Secure Transport is a technology that supports that. The process is documented in the manual for data request management, and the people working on it are DOL because they administer it, the data requesters, and then BEST provides sort of application support, as I understand it. Suggestions, comments, recommendations, concerns?
Susan has her hand raised.
Oh, I'm sorry. I never see this when I do the slide.
I know it's hard. Good morning, folks. Scott, I'm just wondering with respect to the data request management, was there any thought to using some kind of like collaborative software, like, SharePoint or something else, rather than like Excel? I'm just trying to figure out, obviously with the appropriate permissions, since there potentially would be some, cross-agency, requests, that I just was wondering whether or not there was any thought about something where there would just be kind of a centralized repository for that and doing managements with appropriate permissions.
Yeah, let me ask. So I'm going to have a follow-up question. The answer is yes, in short, but are there parts of the request management process that you're thinking of particularly, or just give me a sense of like where you're?
Well, I guess, it's a little ubiquitous in terms of, kind of what we actually mean about data requests, management, but it was just wondering whether or not there are particular steps that people would need to do, and that there's some way to see, has everyone done what they needed to do, rather than a flurry of emails. So just a way of kind of consolidating and also having a consolidated, archive and record of what's occurred.
Yeah, okay, that's perfect. And so I think one of the things we're trying to do is also get the requirements out of this process. And so like that, a couple of things you said are also good examples of what we can put in for requirements, like that there's a record of, what's been done in email, like flurry of emails is an occasionally effective way to get things done for communication, but it's not necessarily great for keeping the record of it. And so I think that we tried to break the request management process into some components, some of which is outside the scope of the technical infrastructure. And we've just been sort of handling internally from OPM because we have to manage a lot of this. But I think the main things that have come up in project management, sort of keeping track of the variety of different tasks. This person needs to sign this document. This
Right.
Document needs to go from point A to point B. This data instruction certificate needs to be signed by June 15th, 2023 or whatever it is. So like that we've tried using a couple different online project management tools. I would be very happy to hear recommendations, particularly from those that are doing it within state agency environments. So we tried that. I think the other one is on the actual the contracts and legal agreements themselves, just handling the signature for that process, which is better that we're in a world where there's electronic signature, but it is still a little bit challenging to kind of keep track of that. So both the signature and the document management itself, which some of the project management tools are not that well designed for.
Thank you, Scott.
I mean the part about like recommendations would be really helpful too. Like we haven't done something that's great, on this. And so if there's suggestions offline or, whatever you want, like that's really helpful. This is a challenging part. It's just going to get more challenging with, with 10 agencies and probably more to come after that. Anything else? All right. Okay, I turn it back to you, but I had 2 more system updates too. I can't remember what's next. Resident advisory.
All right, go for it.
I only have 2 quick system updates before we go into the resident advisory. So 2 follow-ups on meetings from last week. Oh, the 2 follow-ups from the executive board meeting last week. One is that, so I think as folks know, we had, I think, general agreement to move forward. We're working with CSU to resolve a couple of the questions that they've raised before moving to signature on the legal agreements. We've also reached out to governor's office to ask about the event that Commissioner Bai requested. I don't anticipate that we will hear anything until the legislative session is done. So there's a couple weeks for that, but we followed up on a couple of the things that came up from the board meeting. The other thing that I think is a nice outcome from that will, I think, have a more concrete update for this group at an upcoming meeting is after the essentially immediately after the meeting, both in the next day, we had 2 outreaches from the executive board members to other agencies to talk about onboarding or joining P20 win. So we're a little bit in limbo between the current and the proposed future onboarding process, but right now I think there have been sort of requests and expression of interest from 2 more agencies. So we have to go through and dig into that and then go through the process of having them sort of formally express interest, go through the executive board, have the data governing board review it. But just I think it's good news that the executive leadership on the board, took that under their own wing to reach out to other agencies about that. And we have a little homework to do to figure that out. But I think that at an upcoming meeting at some point we'll have more to share on that. So I thought that was good news. And it speaks to the need for sort of some of the better shared tools because there are going to be more people involved at some point in the future. That was it. Those are my updates.
I have my hand raised, if I may.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I know it's hard to see. That's great. More agencies. It's really wonderful. That's awesome. And also want to just share that CSU does definitely support this process going forward, but I wanted to clarify that we have more than just a couple questions about the agreements. We have a number of things that need to be addressed. So I just want the group to know that. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for not clarifying that. Anything else? All right. Katie, I yield back to you.
Okay, so one of the other things that came out of the executive board meeting last week was the creation of a work group for the resident advisory board. And so in the EMOU, it states that we will develop a plan to create a resident advisory board. And so we've been tasked with creating this group to meet for a few hours over the next couple of months to draft a plan that we can present to the executive board for approval so we can move forward in creating the resident advisory board. And so it's not going to be a huge time commitment, just a couple of hours, probably this month and July, so that we can present in August. So if you are interested, please let me know now or reach out to me after this meeting, hoping to get this up and running in the next week or so.
Katie, you can count me in.
Awesome. Great. Okay, so that is okay. Thanks, Jan. Okay, so unless there are questions or comments about the Resident Advisory Board, we can move on to the system sustainability.
I forgot there was a slide for this too.
Oh, no worries. Okay, so another work group that came about as a result of the executive board meeting last week was to review potential funding sources. So again, this is not a huge time commitment. It's about 3 hours with a pre-read. When Commissioner Bai was reviewing different ARPA funding, it became clear that this could be a source of potential funding for P20 wind. So this is another plan that would be presented to the executive board meeting in August. And if you are interested in participating in this, please let me know now or following the meeting, because again, it is June. August will be here quickly. And so we'd like to get this moving. So please let me know if you're interested in participating.
I would be interested.
Great, thank you.
Katie, you can include me as well.
Okay, great. Okay, so if anybody else is interested, please let me know. We can move. So, okay, so we can move on. So next step is basically lots of follow-up regarding the working groups and the data requests, unless there are other issues that folks want to bring up. Okay, so seeing and hearing none, we can wrap up early today. All right.
Great. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.
You too. Bye.
Thank you.